In the summer of 1944, Allied bomber crews over Germany began reporting something impossible. A silvery shape, no propeller, no visible means of propulsion, streaking past their formations at speeds that defied belief. By the time gunners swung their weapons toward it, the shape was gone, vanishing into the distance faster than anything they'd ever seen. Some crews thought they were hallucinating from oxygen deprivation. Others believed the Germans had developed some kind of rocket plane. Both were wrong. What they'd witnessed was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It represented a quantum leap in aviation technology, a machine from the future dropped into a war still being fought with propeller-driven aircraft. In the hands of skilled pilots, it was nearly untouchable. Its speed made pursuit impossible. Its 30-millimeter cannons could shred a B-17 with a single burst. Allied intelligence officers who first examined captured examples couldn't believe the Germans had made it work. Yet for all its revolutionary capabilities, the Me 262 arrived too late to matter. By the time it reached operational squadrons in meaningful numbers, Germany was collapsing. Fuel was scarce. Trained pilots were dead. Airfields were under constant attack. And the aircraft itself, rushed into production, plagued by reliability issues and hamstrung by Hitler's interference, could never fulfill the promise of its design. This is the story of a weapon that should have changed everything, but instead became a symbol of brilliant engineering trapped inside strategic chaos. A machine that proved jet propulsion was possible, practical, and devastating, but arrived in a war that was already lost. Real quick, please like and subscribe to help our channel grow. Now back to the story. The race against physics. The Me 262's origins traced back to 1938, when Messerschmitt engineers began exploring jet propulsion as the future of combat aviation. The concept wasn't new. British engineer Frank Whittle had been developing jet engines since the early 1930s, and the theoretical principles were well understood. But turning theory into a functioning aircraft presented challenges that tested the limits of 1930s metallurgy, aerodynamics, and industrial capacity. Willy Messerschmitt, the brilliant and difficult engineer who designed the Bf-109 fighter, saw jets as the inevitable next step. Propeller-driven aircraft had approached their theoretical speed limits. To go faster required eliminating the propeller entirely and replacing it with a jet engine. A device that compressed air, mixed it with fuel, ignited the mixture, and expelled the resulting exhaust at tremendous velocity. Simple in concept, nightmarishly complex in execution. The biggest obstacle was the engine itself. Early jet designs required turbine blades that could withstand temperatures exceeding 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, while spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. The alloys needed to survive these conditions barely existed in 1938. German metallurgists experimented with countless combinations, searching for materials that wouldn't disintegrate after a few hours of operation. Progress came in frustrating increments, an improvement here, a failure there, each step forward revealing new problems nobody had anticipated. The Jumo 004 turbojet engine, developed by Junkers, eventually became the Me 262's power plant. It was a masterpiece of compromise, using materials Germany could actually produce, with tolerances German manufacturers could actually maintain, at a cost the war economy could theoretically afford. On paper, it could generate 1,980 pounds of thrust and push an aircraft to speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour. In practice, it required constant attention, suffered from flameouts, and wore out faster than conventional engines by an order of magnitude. Test flights began in 1941 using experimental airframes powered by a single jet engine supplemented by a piston engine in the nose, a hedge against the inevitable jet failures. The results were promising enough to justify continued development, but not spectacular enough to prioritize the program over proven designs that were winning battles. The Luftwaffe was still dominant in 1941, still achieving victories with Bf-109s and Fw-190s. Jet fighters seemed like a luxury for a future that felt comfortably distant. Then the war turned. Allied bomber formations began appearing over Germany in growing numbers. The Luftwaffe's fighter force, stretched across multiple fronts, started taking unsustainable losses. By 1943, the need for a high-speed interceptor capable of breaking up bomber formations became urgent. The Me-262, still struggling through development, suddenly represented not a luxury, but a potential lifeline. But development continued to lag. Engine reliability remained abysmal. Turbine blades failed without warning, fuel pumps malfunctioned, and the engines required exotic materials that were increasingly scarce as Allied bombing disrupted supply chains. Each solution created new problems. Improving blade durability required alloys containing chromium and nickel, materials that Germany's war economy desperately needed for other applications. Simplifying the design to use more common materials reduced performance and lifespan. Every engineering decision became a compromise between ideal performance and industrial reality. Resource shortages compounded technical challenges. Allied bombing campaigns targeted German industrial centers, destroying factories that produced precision components. Skilled machinists were conscripted into the Wehrmacht, leaving assembly lines staffed by forced laborers who lacked the expertise to maintain quality control. The Me-262 required manufacturing tolerances far tighter than conventional aircraft. Even small variations in turbine blade dimensions could cause catastrophic failures. As Germany's industrial capacity degraded through 1943 and 1944, maintaining these tolerances became increasingly difficult. Hitler's Blitz bomber. In 1943, as the Me-262 program finally approached production readiness, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would cripple its potential. After witnessing a demonstration of the jet's capabilities, he became fixated on a single idea. The Me-262 should be configured as a Blitz bomber, a high-speed bomber capable of striking Allied invasion forces. The order reflected Hitler's strategic obsession with offense. By 1943, Germany was losing the war. Allied bombers were destroying German cities. Soviet forces were pushing westward. An Allied invasion of France seemed inevitable. Hitler believed that fast bombers capable of striking invasion beaches could disrupt the coming assault, buy time, force negotiations. He saw the Me-262 not as a defensive weapon to protect German skies, but as an offensive tool to strike back at his enemies. This decision was strategically insane and tactically devastating. The Me-262 had been designed as a fighter. Its speed, climb rate, and armament optimized for intercepting bombers. Converting it into a bomber required fundamental compromises. Bomb racks had to be added, increasing weight and drag. The airframe had to be strengthened to handle the stress of carrying external ordnance. These modifications reduced speed, degraded handling, and complicated production at a time when simplicity was essential. More critically, the bomber variant diverted resources and attention from fighter production. Engineers who should have been refining the interceptor design instead worked on bomb delivery systems. Production lines that could have been churning out fighters instead tooled up for bomber variants. Pilot training shifted toward ground attack rather than air-to-air combat. All of this happened while Allied bomber fleets were systematically destroying Germany's ability to wage war. Luftwaffe generals were horrified. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most decorated fighter pilots and a general of the fighter arm, pleaded with Hitler to reconsider. He argued passionately that Germany needed the Me-262 as a defensive fighter, that the bomber variant was a waste of revolutionary technology, that the war would be lost in the air over Germany unless jet fighters could stop the Allied bombing campaign. Hitler dismissed these arguments. He wanted bombers, and his word was final. The debate exemplified the dysfunction at the heart of Nazi Germany's war effort. Technical experts understood what the Me-262 could and should be. But Hitler, surrounded by yes-men and convinced of his own military genius, overruled professional judgment with strategic fantasies. The Führer believed in wonder weapons and dramatic gestures, the V-2 rocket, the super-heavy tanks, the jet bomber that would terrorize invading armies. He didn't grasp that Germany needed practical solutions to immediate problems, not futuristic weapons that wouldn't arrive in time. By the time Hitler partially reversed his decision in late 1944, finally authorizing mass production of the fighter variant, irreplaceable months had been lost. The delays meant fewer aircraft reached operational units during the critical period when they might have made a difference. Every month wasted on the bomber variant was a month of Allied bombers flying unmolested, a month of experienced German pilots dying in conventional fighters, a month closer to inevitable defeat. Combat promise and reality. The Me-262 first saw combat in July 1944 with Erprobungskommando 262, a test and training unit tasked with developing tactics and ironing out operational problems. The early missions revealed both the jet's tremendous potential and its equally tremendous challenges. When everything worked, the Me-262 was devastating. Its speed, over 540 miles per hour in level flight, made it effectively immune to interception by Allied propeller fighters. P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires that dominated German skies couldn't catch a jet that was accelerating away. The Me-262 could dive into bomber formations, fire its 430mm Mk-108 cannons, and escape before escort fighters could react. Those cannons, firing explosive shells at 650 rounds per minute, could destroy a B-17 with a handful of hits. Allied bomber crews who survived encounters described it as being attacked by something from a nightmare. There and gone before defensive fire could track it. But the operational reality was far more complex than these successful engagements suggested. The Me-262's Jumo 004 engines were temperamental and fragile. Throttle movements had to be gentle and gradual. Sudden acceleration could cause flameouts or compressor stalls. The engines took precious seconds to spool up to full power, leaving pilots vulnerable during that window. Fuel consumption was enormous, giving the jet an operational radius of barely 300 miles. And the engines wore out catastrophically fast. Most needed replacement after 25 hours of operation. Some failed after less than 10. By late 1944, elite squadrons like Jagdgeschwader 7 flew operational missions with increasing frequency. JG-7, commanded by high-scoring aces who understood both the jet's capabilities and its limitations, achieved impressive kill ratios, sometimes 4-to-1 against Allied aircraft. These successes attracted attention from propaganda officials eager for good news, and the Me-262 appeared in newsreels and magazines as evidence of German technological superiority. Yet these victories masked deeper problems. Jet units suffered catastrophic losses not from air combat, but from Allied fighters who learned to ambush airfields. The Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing when its engines were spooling up or down, and its speed advantage disappeared. Allied intelligence quickly identified jet bases and assigned fighter squadrons to patrol them constantly. P-51s and Tempests lurked at low altitude near known Me-262 fields, waiting for jets to appear in their landing pattern. Dozens of jets were shot down moments before touchdown or seconds after takeoff, destroyed when they were helpless. By propeller fighters they could have outrun at altitude. Luftwaffe commanders tried various countermeasures. They stationed conventional fighters near jet bases to provide cover during vulnerable phases of flight. They built additional runways to distribute takeoffs and confuse Allied pilots. Some units experimented with grass strips that could be abandoned and relocated quickly. Nothing worked consistently. Allied air superiority was so complete that German airfields existed in a state of constant siege. Every Me-262 sortie required fighting just to get airborne, and fighting again to land safely. Maintenance presented another nightmare. The jet engines required specialist knowledge that few ground crews possessed. Turbine inspections demanded precision instruments and clean working conditions, luxuries in short supply at German airfields in late 1944. Replacement engines often failed to arrive, victims of Allied bombing or simple logistical breakdown. Pilots sometimes found themselves grounded, not from battle damage, but because their aircraft sat waiting for parts that no longer existed. Unit records from early 1945 showed dozens of Me-262s listed as non-operational due to engine problems, lack of fuel, or missing components. The fuel situation became critical as Allied forces advanced. The Me-262 required J-2 jet fuel, essentially kerosene, which was different from the gasoline used by conventional aircraft. Germany's synthetic fuel production, already struggling to meet demand, couldn't produce sufficient quantities of both. Jet units received priority allocation, but priority meant little when the entire fuel supply chain was collapsing. Some aircraft sat fueled and ready, but couldn't fly because reserves needed to be husbanded for more critical missions. Others flew on partial fuel loads that further reduced their already limited range. The numbers that doomed a revolution. Production figures tell the story of the Me-262's failure more clearly than combat reports. Germany manufactured approximately 1,400 Me-262s between 1944 and the war's end. An impressive number for such an advanced aircraft, but a fraction of what would have been needed to affect the war's outcome. More critically, fewer than 300 were combat-ready at any given time. The rest sat in factories awaiting engines, on airfields waiting for parts, or destroyed in Allied bombing raids before they ever flew a mission. Compare this to Allied production. The United States alone produced over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs during the war. Britain built thousands of Spitfires, Mosquitoes, and Typhoons. The Soviet Union churned out fighters by the tens of thousands. Germany's industrial capacity, even functioning perfectly, could never match these numbers. And by 1944, German industry was anything but perfect. Bombed, starved of raw materials, worked by exhausted or unwilling laborers, directed by an increasingly dysfunctional command structure. The Me-262's technical superiority meant nothing against this numerical disparity. A single jet might kill 4 Allied fighters before being destroyed. But when the Allies could replace those 4 fighters overnight, and Germany couldn't replace the jet at all, the mathematics of attrition favored the Allies absolutely. Every Me-262 pilot lost represented irreplaceable experience and training. Every jet destroyed was one that couldn't be replaced quickly enough to matter. Even if production had somehow increased dramatically, other bottlenecks would have prevented decisive impact. Germany lacked sufficient trained jet pilots. The transition from propeller fighters to jets required extensive retraining. Jets flew faster, handled differently, and demanded new tactical thinking. Training took weeks that Germany didn't have, using fuel that Germany couldn't spare, at bases that were under constant attack. Many conventional pilots assigned to jet units received minimal instruction before being thrown into combat. Some died on their first missions, victims of jets they didn't fully understand. Allied intelligence tracked Me-262 deployments carefully and adjusted tactics accordingly. By early 1945, bomber formations flew with massive fighter escorts specifically positioned to counter jet attacks. The P-51s couldn't catch a Me-262 in level flight, but they didn't have to. They could position themselves to intercept jets during their attack runs, force them to break off prematurely, or pursue them back to their bases. American fighter pilots developed the rat race, diving to build speed, then using that momentum to briefly match a jet's velocity during its vulnerable attack phase. It didn't always work, but it worked often enough to make jet operations increasingly costly. The Allied bombing campaign also targeted jet-related infrastructure. Factories producing Jumo 004 engines were bombed repeatedly. Fuel production facilities were priority targets. Airfields known to host jet units received special attention. This systematic campaign didn't stop Me-262 operations, but it prevented them from ever reaching the scale necessary to threaten Allied air superiority. Every jet that made it into the air represented a minor miracle of logistics and improvisation, and miracles don't win wars. The counterfactual that haunts history. Could the Me-262 have changed the war if deployed earlier? The question has haunted historians and aviation enthusiasts for decades. The answer is complex, contingent on multiple variables, and ultimately unknowable. But the analysis reveals much about why Germany lost the air war. If the Me-262 had entered service in early 1943 as a pure interceptor, a year before its actual combat debut, the impact could have been significant. At that point, Allied bomber losses over Germany were already substantial. A jet fighter capable of attacking formations with near impunity might have made the bomber offensive unsustainable. If losses climbed from 5% per mission to 10 or 15%, the combined bomber offensive might have been suspended or dramatically scaled back. That, in turn, could have preserved German industrial capacity, maintained fuel production, and prolonged the war significantly. But this scenario requires everything to go right for Germany. And by 1943, nothing was going right. Even if the Me-262 had been ready earlier, engine reliability would still have been abysmal. Fuel would still have been scarce. Trained pilots would still have been dying faster than they could be replaced. And Allied numerical superiority would still have been overwhelming. A year's head start might have bought time, increased Allied casualties, forced tactical adjustments, but it wouldn't have changed the fundamental arithmetic of the war. More importantly, deploying the Me-262 earlier would have required Nazi Germany to be something it wasn't. It would have required Hitler to listen to his generals and prioritize defense over offense. It would have required a functioning industrial system not yet degraded by bombing. It would have required strategic coherence that the Nazi regime never possessed. The Me-262 arrived late, not because of bad luck or random delays, but because the system that produced it was fundamentally broken. The jet's failure symbolized a larger truth about German technological ambition during the war. Nazi propaganda emphasized wonder weapons, revolutionary designs that would reverse battlefield fortunes through sheer superiority. The Me-262, the V-2 rocket, the Type 21 submarine, the Tiger tank, all represented cutting-edge technology applied to military problems. But technology alone couldn't overcome strategic stupidity, resource shortages, and the industrial might of enemies who could afford to build good enough weapons in overwhelming numbers. By the time the Me-262 arrived in strength, Germany was collapsing. Allied forces were across the Rhine. Soviet armies were approaching Berlin. Fuel reserves were exhausted. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. The Luftwaffe itself was effectively finished as a fighting force. In this context, even a perfect jet fighter couldn't matter. The war was being decided on the ground by armies the Luftwaffe could no longer support and no longer protect. Legacy written in silver. Despite its failure to alter the war's outcome, the Me-262 became the blueprint for modern jet aviation. Both the Allies and Soviets captured examples as they advanced into Germany, often finding jets intact at abandoned airfields. Engineers from multiple nations descended on these aircraft, measuring, photographing, and testing every aspect of their design. American engineers were particularly impressed by the engine nacelle design, the way Messerschmitt had streamlined the Jumo 004's bulky shape to minimize drag. Soviet designers studied the swept-wing concepts that German aerodynamicists had begun exploring for high-speed flight. British engineers examined the fuel and hydraulic systems, learning lessons that would inform their own early jet programs. The Me-262's direct influence appeared in post-war designs almost immediately. The F-86 Sabre, America's first swept-wing jet fighter, incorporated aerodynamic principles derived from German research. The MiG-15, which the Soviets rushed into production after capturing German documents and engineers, showed clear lineage from Me-262 concepts. Even aircraft that looked nothing like the Me-262 benefited from the operational lessons it provided. How to maintain jet engines, how to train jet pilots, how to integrate jets into existing fighter tactics. More broadly, the Me-262 proved that jet propulsion was practical for combat aviation. Before 1944, jets remained experimental, promising but unproven. The Me-262 demonstrated that jets could be manufactured in series, flown by regular pilots, and employed effectively in combat. That validation accelerated jet development worldwide. By 1950, every major air force was transitioning to jets. By 1960, propeller fighters had become obsolete. The revolution the Me-262 initiated continued long after Nazi Germany ceased to exist. Today, Surviving Me-262s sit in museums as artifacts of a particular moment, when the future of aviation became visible, but arrived too late to matter. Visitors who see these aircraft often marvel at how modern they look compared to propeller fighters of the same era. The swept lines, the potted engines, the clean fuselage. They could pass for designs from a decade later. That visual disconnect captures the essential tragedy of the Me-262. It was an aircraft from 1950 trying to fight a war in 1944, built by a nation that was already defeated. The jet that arrived too late became a symbol of technological brilliance trapped inside strategic failure. It showed what German engineering could achieve when pushed to its limits. And it showed that engineering excellence couldn't overcome the consequences of strategic incompetence, resource exhaustion, and fighting a war against enemies with unlimited industrial capacity. In the end, the Me-262 proved that individual weapon systems, no matter how revolutionary, cannot determine wars. Wars are decided by logistics, production, manpower, and strategy. The unglamorous fundamentals that Nazi Germany had lost long before its miracle jet ever reached the skies. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.